Hey there, this is Natalie, and this is a video people have been requesting for quite a while, the Mushoku Tensei Iceberg. If you've never seen an iceberg video before, it basically takes a load of theories and interesting things about a given series, starting with the most commonly known ones at the tip of the iceberg and going down through the layers to the most obscure stuff. I have done one previously about Attack on Titan, which you can check out if you want. Now, while iceberg videos were a bit of a trend a while back, there weren't any for Mushoku Tensei, at least in English, until now. This is most likely because the only iceberg graphic that was out there for the series is in Spanish. Now, I did consider making my own iceberg, but it's more interesting to use one other people in the community made, because there's stuff on here I didn't know about yet, and could research and explain for the video. Also, I'm recovering from a head injury. Yes, my luck just keeps on getting better, and so it would probably have come out weird. So I've just translated the Spanish version and we'll be going through that, explaining everything on it. The trouble is, the iceberg does cover the whole series and spin-offs, and so because I don't like to leave out the anime-onlys who don't want spoilers, I've made two versions. The first one has the stuff that's not going to spoil anything to talk about if you've seen season 1, which I'll go through next. And then the second one has all the spoiler stuff, which I'll do later in the video. I'll tell you when to close the video to avoid spoilers. So, here is our spoiler-free iceberg, and we start with the Roxy manga spin-off. This refers to the manga Roxy Gets Serious, which is a prequel of sorts that features stories from Roxy's life before she met Rudeus. While it is a prequel, the framing device around when she's telling the story does mean that it does contain spoilers. Next, we have extra chapters in the light novels. While the Mushoku Tensei light novel series follows the same story as the original web novels, the author Rifujin Magonote did add in extra content as he was turning his series into light novels. This content doesn't change the plot, but expands on all sorts of things, and there are extra chapters in many of the light novels from different characters' perspectives that give extra information about situations as well as more world building. Comparisons to other isekai is next, and most people are probably aware of the whole Mushoku Tensei was the grandfather of modern isekai thing a lot of people were saying when the anime first came out. I actually said it myself in my first video about the series, but it isn't really true, at least not in the eyes of the author or in terms of the timeline of when popular modern isekai began to be written. One of the most common comparisons is to Re:Zero, because the authors are friends, the series do have some themes in common, and they're about the same age, though the Re:Zero web novel did start a little bit before Mushoku Tensei. I actually have a whole long video comparing the two, if you want to check that out. Next, and as the last one on this layer, Studio Bind was created solely to make the Mushoku Tensei anime. Studio Bind was created as a joint venture between White Fox and Egg Firm, and while they did first work on a couple of episodes of a series called Karakuri Circus, it has been confirmed by the producer of Mushoku Tensei, Nobuhiro Osawa, that the venture was set up with a view to working on Mushoku Tensei. However, while a lot of people believe that this meant that their intention was to only work on Mushoku Tensei, that actually isn't the case. They have already produced one other series, Onimai, and have stated that their long-term plan was that Studio Bind will use Mushoku Tensei as a launchpad for its full-scale animation production business. So now we go further down below the surface and find Elena Lise's curse. We know that Elena Lise has a curse where she has to regularly, get a dose of vitamin D. I'm sorry, they changed the rules about what we can say on here again, and so I'm sticking to innuendo for now. Now we have Paul Gaiden. Paul Gaiden is a series of very short stories from the Mushoku Tensei mobile game that are all about Paul growing up. I have read them and they really are very short and more like little skits than stories, so I've never been sure if it'd be worth doing a reading of them, but let me know in the comments if you want that. And speaking of side stories, we have the big daddy here, Old Dragon's Tale. I've left this in the spoiler-free section because it's not a spoiler to know it exists, but I wouldn't recommend reading it yet if you're avoiding spoilers, because it does have some things in it that will spoil some reveals later in the main story. Old Dragon's Tale is a prequel novel to Mushoku Tensei that takes place thousands of years before Rudeus is born, and has Laplace as its protagonist. It reveals a huge amount of lore and is a great story. Plus, I have a series reading out the full thing on my channel, so if you're not avoiding spoilers, please give it a listen. The manga omitted important parts. The manga adaptation is not generally that well regarded by people who've read the light novels, as it skips important scenes. But one of the biggest things skipped in it was the content of Volume 7, which will be the next arc in the anime. They did actually launch a spin-off manga series last year that does cover that arc, however. Now we come to one that I admittedly didn't know much about, Lex Burner. Lex Burner is a Chinese streamer with over 9 million subscribers who absolutely hated Mushoku Tensei and asked his fans to mass report the anime to try to get it removed from Bilibili, where it was streaming in China. He reportedly said the show promoted mediocrity and could only be enjoyed by poor people, as they'd be the only ones who could relate to the protagonist. He ended up facing legal charges from Bilibili. Now we go down deeper, where we have ideas discarded by Rifujin. I don't know of any specific plotlines that were discarded that don't involve spoilers, other than that Lilia was originally going to die before Rudeus found Aisha. But as trivia goes, he did originally write a story called The Conquest of the Dragon King around 3 years before he started releasing chapters of Mushoku Tensei. He scrapped it because he felt like the story structure made it too complicated. It can be seen as a kind of precursor to Mushoku Tensei and was reissued later as a kind of non-canon spin-off in the same setting. Next, we have the fact that Seven Seas originally censored the English translations of the light novels. In the original versions of the Seven Seas light novels, some fairly significant changes were made, mostly to tone down things Rudeus does, such as having him simply cover Eris up, rather than getting all pervy with her when she's asleep in the barn. This naturally changed the character of Rudeus quite a lot, and when fans realised, they complained. Seven Seas have since reissued more accurate translations of the affected volumes. And now it's down to the next level for the last one I can cover in the spoiler-free section, which is that Rifujin was going to end Mushoku Tensei much earlier. This is a nice, inspiring one, because the story goes that Rifujin became disheartened while writing the story during the early parts of the series, and considered coming up with a premature ending for it. But then he hit #1 on Soyetsu, the site where he was publishing his work, and that was what inspired him to continue, resulting in him going on to create one of the best light novel series of all time. So that's really all I can cover without getting into spoilers. So if you don't know or don't want to know things that will happen after season 1 of the anime, it's time to say goodbye for this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon. And now we can look at the rest of the iceberg. At the top tier, we have 2 that I think I can cover together, Redundancy and Jobless Oblige. These are side stories that take place after the main campaign of the main story, but before Rudeus's death. Redundancy is a compilation of stories that are a mix of slice-of-life type stuff about Rudeus and his family, and stories that tie up loose ends for various side characters, such as telling us who various people end up marrying, and some of what happens to Rudeus's children. Jobless Oblige takes place in the same time period, but it's a full-length novel about Rudeus's son, Sieghart. I have a series reading out Jobless Oblige on my channel. It's currently missing the last few chapters due to the fact those videos really kill me in the algorithm, and where I've had to take some breaks in content, it's just not a good time to release that kind of thing. But the chapters that are there do get up to the conclusion of the main plotline, so it won't leave you hanging if you want to listen to it. At the next level, we have Luicilia Superdia, who is in fact a character who appears in Redundancy. She's the daughter of Rijerd and Norn, who get married in the first Redundancy story. She's very interesting because it seems she's been Orsted's friend in all of his previous time loops, where Norn and Rijerd are destined to meet and get together, even in timelines where Rudeus doesn't exist. In other Orsted loops, she was the last remaining spurred warrior, and Orsted originally looked for her because the spurred's third eye could see the weakness on the demon god Laplace. However, even after realising from other time loops that he didn't actually need her for this, he always still seeks her out, because she was a good friend. In Redundancy, this means he tries to matchmake with Rijerd and Norn through Rudeus to ensure that his bestie is born, only to find out they'd been in love all along. Next we have Future Diary. This refers to Turning Point 4, where Rudeus is visited by an old version of himself from the future who comes from a timeline where everything has gone very wrong, and Rudeus himself has become something of a monster. He's learned time travel magic to go back to the point in his own life when it all started going wrong, so he can warn our Rudeus not to make the same mistakes. He gives him a diary he's been keeping that explained what happened in his timeline before dying, due to the magic he'd used being incomplete. If you want to know all about this, check out my video about Turning Point 4, as it's all covered there, including what's in the diary. The next one was another one that was news to me. There is a drama CD that accompanies Volume 12 and gives an audio version of the events that take place in the novel. It's in 2 parts, with the first being the venture into the teleportation labyrinth and the rescue of Roxy, and the second being the Hydra battle. This was only available in Japanese, as you might expect, but would be the only dramatic representation of this part of the story until, of course, it appears in the anime. Now we come to Aisha and Ars. This refers to a section of Redundancy that was deleted by the author, which features a relationship between Aisha and Rudeus's son Ars. I do have a whole video explaining what happens in the story, its current canon status, and the story behind why Rifujin deleted it, so I won't go over all of that again here. Another one I don't need to spend too much time on because it's probably something you already know, and it's covered in detail in my video about Orsted if you don't, but it's Orsted's time loops. Orsted was put into a state of being reincarnated to the same point in time every 200 years if he fails to meet his objective of killing Hitagami. In the loop where he meets Rudeus, he's lost count of how many loops he's lived through. We see how he was sent into this situation in Old Dragon's Tale. Next up, we've got Rudeus Shouldn't Exist. It's only revealed how Rudeus ended up being reincarnated in the very final chapter of the main story, and the exact details of this are explained in my video about the mass teleportation incident. So again, I'm not going to go over the whole complicated story here, but essentially it was by pure accident, where he died in his original world at the same moment and location that Nanahoshi and Akihito were being summoned, and there'll be more about that later in this video. His spirit passed through the rift that was created and eventually inhabited the first child of Zenith Greyrat, which had been stillborn in all of Orsted's other loops. The existence of Rudeus is effectively what causes changes and knock-on effects that make this loop substantially different from any other that Orsted has seen, and probably will have set Orsted up with a chance of success he could never break through and find before, though we'll have to wait for the sequel to find out how that plays out for him. So now we dive down to the next level, where we have what happened to Lucy in the alternate future. This refers back to the timeline in the Future Diary. Lucy is Rudeus's first child, whose mother is Sylphie. He receives the diary after Lucy is born, so she must exist in the timeline described in the diary. However, while we find out what happens to Sylphie and the rest of Rudeus's household in that version of the future, it's never really clear what happened to Lucy. There are probably 2 possibilities here. Either Lucy was killed in retaliation for Rudeus trying to steal secrets from Millis, as many other people in his life were, or she was taken with Sylphie to Azra and killed alongside Sylphie and Ariel. Again, there's a lot more about the alternate future in my Turning Point 4 video, but the answer to what happened to Lucy is not explicitly stated. This was probably just to avoid outright talking about the death of a little kid when it could just be implied by the fact the rest of the family all were killed. Next up, Nanahoshi unaliving herself. And no, if you haven't finished the story yet, Nanahoshi is still alive and primed to play a part in the sequel. So I assume this also refers to the alternate timeline. Nanahoshi does fall into a state of absolute despair when her first experiments to go home fail, but Rudeus and his friends are able to help her out of this. But in the alternate future, he wouldn't have been there to do this. Next, Rudeus has senile dementia. We do see the moments before Rudeus's death of old age in Mushoku Tensei, and he struggles with things like remembering that Eris has also passed away a few years earlier, so it seems likely that this is true. Finally, for this layer, it's all Hitagami's fault. And this is definitely the case, with Hitagami having been manipulating people for thousands of years, with the goal of preventing his own death. But we find out in Old Dragon's Tale that he's responsible for things even further back than that. Check out my video on him for more about that. At the deepest layer of the iceberg, we have 3 things that all relate to the very end of the main series. The first is, what was the irregularity that summoned Shinohara Akihito? So, if you don't already know, Akihito is Nanahoshi's boyfriend from our world, and one of the teenagers Rudeus saved before he died and was reincarnated. We find out in the end of Mushoku Tensei that the whole story, including Rudeus and Nanahoshi being brought over to the Mushoku Tensei world, was triggered because a Miko called Riria, who has the ability to turn back time by 24 hours, was used in the summoning of a hero from another world. They do this because of a prophecy that a summoned hero can save the kingdom, which is implied to be Azura. This happens in the future of the main story, after the point in time when Rudeus dies. The hero that comes through is Akihito, just a random Japanese teenager, classic isekai protagonist. But the kingdom has so much faith in the prophecy that they give him no training at all, and he dies in battle pretty much instantly. During the time between him being summoned and dying in battle, the Miko Riria fell in love with him. So she basically burns through all of her powers in a final wish that she could live again and be with him again. This is what causes the rift to open that Rudeus's soul passes through, and for Nanahoshi to be summoned into the past so she can help prepare for Akihito's arrival, because like Riria, she also loved him. I'm being as quick and vague in this explanation as possible because, as I've said before, it's all in my video about the mass teleportation incident already, and it's really complicated. But effectively, the question asked here on the iceberg is, what caused it to be Akihito who was summoned the first time around? We have no answer to this, but given he's expected to be a major character, or in my view, probably the protagonist for the sequel, we may eventually find out. Or, like Rudeus, it could have been completely random. An alternative theory is that the prophecy was further reaching, perhaps knowing that it would take that boy in that location being summoned and then dying to trigger the whole series of events that took place in Mushoku Tensei, leading to Orsted's final loop. We can't know yet, but it's interesting to think about. Next, we have Riria's Hell. This ties into the same part of the story. Riria. As a quick aside, her name has always seemed like a strange choice to me, given L's and R's are translated interchangeably from Japanese due to the sounds used in the language. So isn't her name essentially the same as the character of Lilia? Obviously, it's not odd for 2 people in a world to have the same name, but it's usually avoided. Unless you're George R.R. Martin and want us to keep track of 19 different people called Bran. But I digress. Riria was also known as the time-turning Miko due to her ability. From her perspective, she was reborn over and over again, always living a miserable life where the kingdom discovered her power, took her from her family, and used her as a tool until she always, ultimately, died young. It's likely that a side effect of her power is that she can remember previous time loops, which means that when she's born in each of Orsted's many loops, she still remembers her previous lives and her own deaths, where nobody else does. I go into this more in my video about how time works in Mushoku Tensei, but effectively, Rirya seems to be in an endless cycle of miserable lives and horrible deaths until the loop where Akihito was summoned, which is what caused her to fall in love with him. And finally we have, there isn't an afterlife in the world of Mushoku Tensei. This would seem to be the case. We see Rudeus die of old age late in the story, and after a final talk with Hitagami, he basically seems to pass on to nothing, satisfied with the life he led, and entrusting the final battle against Hitagami to those who remain. And so, with that, we reach the end of the iceberg. I'm sure there are dozens of other interesting points and theories that could have gone on here, and I'm sorry for so many times referring to you to my other videos. But some of these points I've already got long, in-depth videos about, and trying to explain them again here would be redundant and make the video 5 hours long. Still, I hope you found this interesting, and let me know in the comments what else you would have included, though leave a spoiler warning if it is post-anime stuff. Thank you as always to my supporters on Patreon, and also a huge thank you to those who helped me out on Ko-fi following my last video. I'm only showing the names of the Patreon supporters because I think in a lot of cases, Ko-fi shows me people's real names rather than what they go on online. But I'm so grateful for everybody who's helped me out following the problems I had with Google. Thank you too to everyone who helps me out simply by subscribing to my channel and watching my videos. Thank you for watching this one, and I hope to see you again very soon.